December 7th, 1941, 7:48 in the morning. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the flagship Nagato, anchored in Hashirajima Bay, smoking an American cigarette. His carrier fleet was halfway across the Pacific, executing an attack plan he'd designed himself. And while his staff officers celebrated the early radio reports of burning ships at Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto remained silent. He'd spent 3 years in the United States during the 1920s as a naval attaché. He'd driven from Detroit to Texas and seen what his colleagues in Tokyo dismissed as propaganda. He knew what was coming. He'd written about it months earlier in a letter to a politician who'd demanded guarantees of victory. The letter contained no optimism, only mathematics. Japan had just attacked an industrial empire that produced more steel in a single month than Japan manufactured in an entire year. The celebration happening around him was premature. Yamamoto understood something his government refused to accept. Wars between industrialized nations weren't won through samurai spirit or tactical brilliance alone. They were won in factories, in shipyards, and in the sprawling automotive plants where a single company could manufacture 15,000 parts into a finished automobile every 69 seconds. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The previous year, in October of 1940, Yamamoto had warned Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye in explicit terms. If ordered to fight the United States, he could guarantee Japan would run wild for the first 6 months, perhaps a year at most. After that, he had no confidence whatsoever about the outcome. This wasn't a cautious military officer hedging his predictions. This was a man who'd studied industrial economics at Harvard University, stating a provable fact. By late 1941, American automobile factories in Detroit employed production systems so refined they could deliver a complete vehicle every minute. Those same assembly lines could be retooled to produce tanks, aircraft engines, and artillery pieces using identical mass production principles. Japanese factories still relied on skilled craftsmen building individual components by hand. The attack on Pearl Harbor succeeded tactically. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, over 2,000 Americans killed. But Yamamoto understood immediately that the strategic objective had failed. His plan required destroying American aircraft carriers to buy Japan the time necessary to fortify Pacific holdings before American industry mobilized fully. All 3 Pacific fleet carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were at sea during the attack, completely untouched. Worse still, Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks, submarine base, and repair facilities remained intact. The American Pacific Fleet would be operational within months, and behind it stood the entire productive capacity of the United States. The numbers were catastrophic for Japan, but they were provable, verifiable, and Yamamoto had calculated them all. In 1939, the final full year before European war erupted, the United States produced slightly fewer than 3,000 military aircraft. That number seemed manageable to Japanese military planners who assumed American dedication to military production would never match Japanese commitment. They were measuring the wrong variable. They should have been measuring potential capacity, not current output. Ford's River Rouge plant in Dearborn, Michigan, covered 1,100 acres under roof and employed 75,000 workers manufacturing civilian vehicles. Converting that plant to military production wouldn't require building new facilities or training a new workforce. It required changing blueprints and retooling machines that already existed. On January 9, 1942, exactly 1 month after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto received a letter from Ogata Taketora, editor-in-chief of the Asahi Shimbun newspaper. Ogata wanted reassurances for a patriotic editorial celebrating Japan's string of early victories in the Philippines and Malaya. Yamamoto's reply contained no celebration whatsoever. He wrote that a military man could scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It was more a matter of shame. He advised Ogata to wait before making assessments, because America, angered and outraged, would certainly launch a determined counterattack. The letter was prophetic. Within 6 months, American industrial mobilization would prove more devastating than any military defeat Japan suffered at sea. The United States government understood the mathematics as clearly as Yamamoto did. On May 29, 1940, more than 18 months before Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt announced production targets that German military analysts dismissed as impossible propaganda. Roosevelt called for the United States to produce 185,000 aircraft, 120,000 tanks, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 18 million tons of merchant shipping within 2 years. Adolf Hitler's advisors assured him this was American political theater. In 1939, American military aircraft production totaled fewer than 3,000 planes annually. The idea that production could increase 60-fold in 24 months seemed mathematically absurd. The German assessment contained a fatal error. They'd calculated based on Germany's own industrial model, where military production required purpose-built factories staffed by specialized workers, producing weapons using traditional manufacturing methods. American industrial capacity operated on completely different principles. Henry Ford had revolutionized automobile production in 1913 by applying Frederick Taylor's scientific management theories to moving assembly lines. By 1941, that system had been refined across American industry for nearly 3 decades. Every major manufacturer in Detroit understood how to break complex products into hundreds of simplified tasks that semi-skilled workers could master in days or weeks rather than years. Converting automobile plants to military production didn't mean teaching craftsmen new skills. It meant redesigning military equipment to fit existing manufacturing processes. The Chrysler Corporation demonstrated this principle with brutal efficiency. In August 1940, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, the United States government commissioned Chrysler to design and build a dedicated tank production facility. Architect Albert Kahn created the Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, covering 113 acres in Warren, Michigan. The building's design prioritized floor space for assembly line operations, identical to those used in automobile factories. By April 1942, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the Detroit Arsenal produced its first M3 tanks. The facility scaled production immediately, using the same moving assembly principles that manufactured civilian sedans. By 1943, a single year later, that one plant produced 35 tanks daily. Japanese industry produced fewer than 5,000 tanks during the entire war. Yamamoto had witnessed this industrial capacity personally. During his posting in Washington from 1926 to 1928, he'd traveled extensively throughout American industrial centers. He visited Ford's Highland Park plant, where mass production techniques were perfected. He toured oil fields in Texas that produced more petroleum in a single week than Japan's entire empire controlled. Most significantly, he spent time in Seattle at Boeing's aircraft facilities, watching workers assemble commercial aircraft using standardized parts and simplified assembly procedures. The visit taught him something Japanese military planners refused to acknowledge. American manufacturing didn't rely on individual craftsman expertise. It relied on system efficiency that could be replicated across hundreds of facilities simultaneously. This systemic approach became devastatingly apparent in shipbuilding. Traditional naval construction required 18 to 24 months to complete a destroyer, with each vessel essentially handcrafted by skilled shipwrights. American industrialist Henry Kaiser, who'd made his fortune building dams using prefabrication techniques, saw an opportunity. In 1941, Kaiser proposed applying mass production principles to Liberty ship construction. He designed a system where ships would be built in modular sections, fabricated simultaneously in different locations, then welded together rapidly in shipyards. Maritime experts insisted this approach would produce inferior vessels that would break apart in heavy seas. Kaiser proceeded anyway, and the results demolished traditional shipbuilding assumptions. The first Liberty ship, the SS Patrick Henry, took 244 days to complete in September 1941. By December 1942, Kaiser's Richmond Shipyard No. 2 reduced construction time to 41 days. In November 1942, the Robert E. Peary was assembled in just 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. This wasn't a one-time demonstration. Kaiser's shipyards, employing tens of thousands of workers using prefabrication and welding techniques, produced vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. By autumn 1943, every Allied ship sunk since 1939 had been replaced. America launched more vessels in 1941 alone than Japan produced during the entire war. The Japanese High Command observed these production figures with growing alarm, but they fundamentally misunderstood what enabled American industrial output. Japanese military planners attributed American productivity to greater access to raw materials, which was partially accurate. American steel production, in 1941, totaled 75 million tons, compared to Japan's 7 million. But resource access explained only part of the disparity. The larger advantage came from how Americans organized production systems. Japanese factories typically operated single shifts 5 days weekly, relying on skilled workers who couldn't be easily replaced. American factories operated multiple shifts 7 days weekly, staffed by workers performing specialized tasks that required minimal training. When American men enlisted in military service by the millions through 1942, factories didn't shut down. They hired women, trained them in 2 to 3 weeks, and maintained production rates that continuously increased. Boeing's Seattle plant illustrated this transformation perfectly. In November 1941, the facility employed 73 women in production roles out of 11,000 total workers. By January 1943, 14 months later, 12,000 women worked Boeing assembly lines alongside male colleagues. These weren't clerical workers or nurses. They were riveters, welders, and machinists performing identical tasks to male workers they replaced. A housewife from Ballard, who'd never touched industrial equipment, learned to operate pneumatic rivet guns in 3 weeks of training, then spent the next 2 years installing rivets in B-17 wings with defect rates lower than experienced male workers. The training program demonstrated something Japanese industry couldn't replicate. American manufacturing systems were designed around simplicity and standardization, specifically so that workers could be trained rapidly and replaced easily. Skills resided in the system, not in individual workers. This systematic approach extended to every aspect of American war production. The Ford Motor Company received contracts to produce Pratt & Whitney aircraft engines for B-24 Liberator bombers. Ford engineers studied the engine design and immediately identified opportunities for mass production improvement. They redesigned component manufacturing processes, created specialized tooling, and established assembly line procedures. By 1944, Ford's engine plant delivered finished aircraft engines at a rate of 1 complete unit every 48 minutes. Pratt & Whitney's traditional manufacturing approach produced engines at perhaps 1/10 that rate. Ford hadn't discovered new metallurgical techniques or improved engine performance. They'd simply applied existing mass production principles to a product originally designed for hand assembly. The Japanese Imperial Navy watched American production accelerate through 1942 and 1943 with increasing desperation. In June 1942, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, as Yamamoto had predicted, Japan suffered its first major naval defeat at Midway. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk. The loss represented 2 years of construction capacity and thousands of trained naval aviators who couldn't be replaced. The United States commissioned 9 new Essex-class carriers during 1943 alone. Japanese shipyards completed exactly 0 fleet carriers that same year. The disparity wasn't just numerical, it was existential. Japan was fighting an opponent who could absorb catastrophic losses and replace them within months. Japan couldn't afford a single major defeat. By early 1943, American aircraft production reached rates that Japanese military analysts literally couldn't believe. Reports reaching Tokyo claimed American factories produced 1,500 bombers monthly. Japanese intelligence officers insisted these figures must be exaggerated, tenfold, because such production rates seemed physically impossible. They weren't impossible. they were documented reality. Willow Run, Ford's dedicated B-24 production facility near Detroit, measured 1 mile long by a quarter-mile wide, 3.5 million square feet under a single roof, specifically designed for moving assembly line bomber production. In March 1944, Willow Run delivered 432 completed B-24s, more than 1 bomber per hour, every hour, 24 hours daily. Each aircraft contained 360,000 rivets, 1,500 feet of electrical wiring, and 4,800 square feet of aluminum skin. Ford had essentially turned strategic bombers into automobiles, manufactured using identical mass production principles. Yamamoto never witnessed the full scale of American industrial mobilization he'd predicted. On April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications revealing Yamamoto's inspection tour itinerary through the Solomon Islands. 16 P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville and shot it down. Yamamoto died instantly when the plane crashed into jungle terrain. His death came exactly 4 months before the Battle of Midway's 1-year anniversary and 11 months before American industrial production reached its absolute peak. He'd accurately predicted Japan couldn't win a protracted war against American industrial capacity. He didn't live long enough to see precisely how correct that assessment proved to be. The prophecy Yamamoto made in his January 1942 letter to Ogata Taketora had materialized exactly as he'd written. America, angered and outraged, launched a determined counterattack that wasn't primarily military. It was industrial. American factories became weapons more devastating than any battleship or bomber squadron. They produced equipment faster than Japan could destroy it, forcing Japanese forces into an unwinnable war of attrition, where every loss was permanent, while American losses were temporary setbacks, quickly replaced by fresh equipment arriving from California, Michigan, and Pennsylvania shipyards and aircraft plants. By 1944, the production disparity had become so severe that Japanese military strategy focused entirely on making American victory as costly as possible, rather than attempting to actually win. Kamikaze tactics reflected this strategic desperation. When a nation instructs pilots to deliberately crash aircraft into enemy ships, it acknowledges that conventional military operations have failed, and only symbolic resistance remains possible. The decision represented complete industrial defeat. Japan couldn't build aircraft fast enough to match American production, so they optimized for maximum damage per plane by removing landing gear, reducing fuel loads, and guaranteeing each aircraft destroyed at least one American vessel before being lost. The calculus revealed everything. Japanese planners weren't trying to win anymore. They were trying to make surrender politically acceptable by inflicting enough casualties that America might negotiate rather than demand unconditional capitulation. The industrial gulf between America and Japan in 1944 was so vast it barely qualified as peer competition. In that single year, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft. Japan produced 28,000. American shipyards delivered carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and support vessels totaling millions of tons of displacement. Japanese shipyards struggled to replace destroyed vessels at a fraction of the loss rate. American factories manufactured tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, small arms, ammunition, uniforms, field rations, medical supplies, and every other material requirement for military operations across 2 oceans, simultaneously. Japan couldn't adequately supply its forces fighting in a single theater. The war had become a demonstration of industrial capacity, not military tactics, and Japan had been defeated in factories in Michigan and California long before American soldiers landed on Japanese home islands. The sleeping giant metaphor attributed to Yamamoto, whether he actually said those specific words or not, captured a fundamental truth about what happened after Pearl Harbor. The attack succeeded tactically, but failed strategically, because it transformed American industrial potential into focused military production. Before December 1941, American factories were producing automobiles, refrigerators, and consumer goods, while military spending represented roughly 9% of national economic output. After Pearl Harbor, industrial capacity pivoted completely toward military production. By 1944, military spending consumed 79% of American gross domestic product. That wasn't mobilization. That was total industrial warfare, where virtually every factory, every trained worker, and every raw material resource focused exclusively on military production. Yamamoto had understood this possibility before the war started, which explained his perpetual pessimism about Japanese prospects for victory. He'd written repeatedly to colleagues and superiors that fighting America meant fighting the entire industrialized world, because American productive capacity exceeded that of all other nations combined. His warnings were ignored by military planners who believed Japanese fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages. This was wishful thinking masquerading as strategy. Industrial wars aren't won through superior morale or tactical excellence. They're won by whoever can build more tanks, ships, and aircraft than their opponent can destroy. By that metric, Japan lost the war in 1942, when American production lines began operating at full capacity. Everything that happened afterward was just confirming what the mathematics had already demonstrated. The strategic irony was perfect. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor specifically to prevent American intervention in Southeast Asian resource areas Japan needed to sustain its war in China. The attack was supposed to buy time for Japan to consolidate territorial gains before American forces could respond. Instead, it guaranteed American entry into the war with complete public unity and motivated American industry to reach production levels that turned the Pacific into an American lake within 30 months. Yamamoto's prediction about running wild for 6 months proved almost exactly correct. By mid-1942, the tide had turned permanently. Not because American forces were better trained or more courageous than Japanese troops, but because American factories were building destroyers, bombers, and tanks faster than combat operations could use them, while Japanese industry struggled to replace equipment lost in battle. The verification of Yamamoto's assessment came from multiple sources throughout 1943 and 1944, but perhaps none more telling than Japanese industrial reports captured after the war. Japanese planners had calculated in early 1941 that matching American industrial production would require Japan to quintuple its industrial capacity. This was impossible given Japan's limited access to raw materials, minimal automated manufacturing capability, and lack of standardized mass production systems. The recommendation was obvious. Japan couldn't win an industrial war against the United States, and therefore shouldn't start one. That advice was rejected by military leaders who believed initial tactical victories would force American negotiation. The assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The carrier production gap illustrated this disparity with mathematical precision. After the Battle of Midway in June 1942 cost Japan 4 fleet carriers, the Imperial Navy's construction plans became increasingly desperate and unrealistic. In the 3 years following Midway, Japan managed to commission 6 new aircraft carriers. 3 were conversions from existing merchant vessels or partially completed cruiser hulls. Only 3 were purpose-built carriers from the keel up. The USS Taiho, Japan's most advanced carrier completed during the war, required 32 months from keel laying to commissioning. The USS Essex, laid down less than 3 months before Taiho, was commissioned in just 20 months. That 12-month difference represented the gap between American and Japanese industrial efficiency. The United States built 17 Essex-class fleet carriers during that same 3-year period. Not conversions or light carriers, but purpose-built fleet carriers displacing 27,500 tons standard, each capable of operating 90-30 to 100 aircraft. Every 2 months through 1943 and 1944, another Essex-class carrier joined the Pacific Fleet. USS Essex commissioned December 31, 1942. USS Lexington followed in February 1943. USS Yorktown in April, USS Intrepid in August. The procession continued relentlessly. By November 1943, Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force, operated with such overwhelming strength that Japanese naval forces avoided engaging American carriers whenever possible. The Essex construction program, demonstrated systematic efficiency that Japan couldn't replicate. USS Yorktown, designated CV-10 to distinguish her from the original Yorktown sunk at Midway, took just 16.5 months from keel laying to commissioning. Her construction began at Newport News Shipbuilding on December 1, 1941, just 6 days before Pearl Harbor. She commissioned April 15, 1943, and sailed for the Pacific in May. By November, she'd already participated in raids on Wake Island and the Gilbert Islands. That timeline, from bare steel to combat operations in 18 months, represented industrial capacity Japan couldn't approach. Japanese shipyards struggled with basic resource constraints. The Unryu-class carriers, Japan's attempt to produce fleet carriers quickly using simplified designs based on the pre-war Hiryu, took approximately 2 years each to complete. Only 3 of 6 planned ships commissioned before the war ended. USS Unryu commissioned in August 1944. USS Amagi followed in October. USS Katsuragi commissioned in February 1945. These carriers displaced 17,000 tons, roughly 60% the size of an Essex, and carried fewer aircraft with less fuel and ammunition storage. Even this compromised design couldn't be produced fast enough to matter. By the time Unryu commissioned, the United States had already put 14 Essex-class carriers into service. The production disparity extended beyond numbers to operational capability. American carriers commissioned with complete air groups, trained pilots, experienced maintenance crews, and full logistics support. Japanese carriers commissioned with partial air groups because pilot training couldn't keep pace with ship construction. The carrier Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull and the largest carrier ever built at 62,000 tons displacement, commissioned November 19, 1944, with almost no aircraft aboard. She was supposed to transport aircraft and serve as a floating repair facility for damaged carriers. 10 days after commissioning, while being moved from Yokosuka to Kure for final fitting out, the American submarine USS Archerfish torpedoed Shinano. She sank with minimal operational capability, having never conducted a single combat mission. The largest carrier in history became the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. American industrial mobilization achieved results that seemed impossible based on 1941 production capacity. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft. Japan produced 28,000 during that same year. The disparity in bombers specifically was even more dramatic. American factories delivered roughly 12,000 heavy bombers in 1944. B-17s, B-24s, and B-29s rolled off assembly lines faster than operational units could absorb them. By spring 1945, surplus B-24s sat in storage at modification centers, waiting for assignment because production exceeded combat attrition. Japan never developed a true heavy bomber program comparable to American capabilities. Their heaviest operational bomber, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty, couldn't match the range, payload, or defensive armament of American heavy bombers. Japan built approximately 2,400 G4Ms during the entire war. The production advantage cascaded through every equipment category. American factories delivered 300,000 artillery pieces during the war. Japan produced approximately 15,000. American shipyards launched 88,000 landing craft of all types. Japan produced roughly 2,000. American industry manufactured 86,000 tanks. Japan produced approximately 5,000. These weren't marginal advantages. They were order-of-magnitude disparities that made sustained combat operations impossible for Japanese forces. Every tank destroyed, every artillery piece lost, every aircraft shot down represented an irreplaceable asset for Japan, while American forces could request replacement equipment that would arrive within weeks. Liberty Ship Program exemplified American industrial capacity at its most overwhelming. These cargo vessels, mass-produced using prefabrication and welding techniques developed by Henry Kaiser, transformed merchant shipping construction. Traditional shipbuilding produced perhaps one vessel every 6 to 8 months per shipyard. Kaiser's Richmond Shipyard No. 2 reduced construction time to an average of 45 days per vessel by late 1942. In November 1942, the Robert E. Peary was assembled in 4 days and 15.5 hours from keel, laying to launch. This wasn't a stripped-down hull. It was a complete 10,000-ton cargo vessel capable of crossing the Pacific, carrying 5,000 tons of military equipment. By autumn 1943, every merchant ship sunk since September 1939 had been replaced by new construction. American shipyards were building vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. The strategic implications were straightforward. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor to prevent American intervention, while Japan consolidated control over Southeast Asian resource areas. The attack was supposed to buy time, 18 months to 2 years, for Japan to create defensive positions strong enough that American forces couldn't dislodge them without unacceptable casualties. This calculation assumed American industrial mobilization would take years to reach full capacity based on how long European nations required to transition from peacetime to wartime production. The assumption was wrong. American industry reached effective mobilization by mid-1942, barely 6 months after Pearl Harbor. By early 1943, American production capacity exceeded that of all Axis powers combined. Yamamoto's death in April 1943 meant he witnessed only the beginning of American industrial dominance. He saw the Battle of Midway demonstrate that tactical victories couldn't compensate for strategic disadvantages. He observed American carrier production accelerating through late 1942 and early 1943. He recognized that Japan had lost the war before most Japanese military leaders admitted the possibility of defeat. But he didn't live to see the full manifestation of American industrial power in 1944 and 1945, when American forces operated with such material superiority that Japanese resistance became militarily futile even if politically necessary. The industrial statistics from 1944 revealed the scope of American dominance. In that single year, American factories produced more military aircraft than Germany, and Japan produced combined during the entire war. American shipyards delivered more tonnage in 1944 than Japan launched throughout the war. American automotive factories manufactured more military vehicles in 1944 than all Axis nations produced in 5 years of war production. This wasn't just winning, this was industrial annihilation, where one combatant possessed such overwhelming productive capacity that the outcome became inevitable regardless of tactical successes or battlefield courage. The fast carrier task force that dominated Pacific operations from mid-1943 onward represented this industrial capacity in concentrated form. Task Force 58 operated with 15 fleet carriers by early 1944. These weren't scattered units operating independently. They were organized into carrier groups that could concentrate hundreds of aircraft against single targets, overwhelming Japanese air defenses through sheer numbers. When Task Force 58 struck Truk Lagoon in February 1944, attacking Japan's primary naval base in the Central Pacific, American carrier aircraft flew approximately 500 sorties over 2 days. They sank 12 warships, 32 merchant vessels, and destroyed nearly 300 aircraft on the ground and in the air. Japanese defenders couldn't stop the raids because they couldn't contest control of the air against that many aircraft supported by that many carriers. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated absolute American air superiority. Japanese carrier aircraft attacked Task Force 58 in waves, while American fighters intercepted them far from the fleet. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because Japanese aircraft fell so easily to American fighters that barely faced opposition. Japan lost approximately 600 aircraft over 2 days. American forces lost roughly 123 aircraft, mostly to mechanical failures and operational accidents rather than combat. The 3 Japanese carriers sunk during the battle represented irreplaceable losses. The United States had already commissioned replacement carriers for vessels that hadn't been sunk yet. By autumn 1944, Japan's strategic position had collapsed entirely. The Philippines, Japan's crucial link to Southeast Asian resources, came under sustained American attack. Japanese forces couldn't prevent American landings because they no longer controlled the surrounding seas or skies. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 saw Japan commit virtually every operational warship remaining to prevent American forces from retaking the Philippines. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The combined fleet effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. American losses were minimal. 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort, all replaceable within weeks, through ongoing production. The decision to employ kamikaze tactics beginning in October 1944 reflected complete industrial defeat. When a military deliberately crashes aircraft into enemy ships, because conventional tactics can't achieve results, it acknowledges that producing sufficient aircraft for normal operations has become impossible. Japanese factories couldn't build aircraft fast enough to maintain operational strength, so Japanese commanders optimized for maximum damage per plane by guaranteeing each aircraft destroyed at least 1 enemy vessel before being lost. The calculus was desperate. American shipyards could replace destroyed vessels faster than kamikaze attacks could sink them, and Japanese pilot training programs couldn't produce replacement aviators fast enough to sustain kamikaze operations indefinitely. The tactic represented strategic bankruptcy, disguised as fighting spirit. American forces invaded Okinawa in April 1945 with overwhelming naval support. 14 fleet carriers, 18 escort carriers, 7 battleships, 18 cruisers, and 58 destroyers supported landing operations. Task Force 58 alone embarked more than 1,000 aircraft. Japanese forces couldn't contest this armada. They launched kamikaze attacks that damaged dozens of American ships and sank several, but they couldn't prevent American forces from establishing complete control over Okinawa. The battle lasted 82 days and cost Japan approximately 7,500 aircraft destroyed. American forces could sustain those loss rates indefinitely. Japan couldn't sustain them for another month. The industrial foundation Yamamoto feared in December 1941 had materialized exactly as he'd predicted. American factories produced military equipment at rates that made Japanese resistance mathematically futile. By August 1945, American forces possessed such overwhelming material superiority that invading Japan's home islands, while costly in casualties, was operationally guaranteed to succeed. Japan surrendered not because atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though those attacks certainly influenced the decision. Japan surrendered because continued resistance achieved nothing except additional destruction, while the outcome remained predetermined by industrial capacity. The sleeping giant metaphor, whether Yamamoto actually spoke those words or they were attributed to him later, captured the essential truth about what happened after Pearl Harbor. The attack succeeded tactically but failed strategically because it transformed American industrial potential into focused military production. That transformation took 6 months, not the 2 years Japan needed to consolidate defensive positions. By mid-1942, American industrial mobilization had already determined the war's outcome. Everything afterward was simply confirming what the mathematics had demonstrated. Wars between industrialized nations aren't won through tactical brilliance or superior fighting spirit. They're won by whoever builds more equipment than their opponent can destroy. Yamamoto understood this before the war started. His government ignored the warning and discovered he'd been correct all along. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.